Have you ever wondered what would happen if a Norse god had to survive school? Today, we're joined by the brilliant Louis Stowell, author of the hilarious Loki, A Bad God's Guide series. So get ready for some mischief as we dive into the ironic world of life lessons with Loki and find out why the ultimate trickster might just be the perfect guide to growing up. So welcome to the Valhalla podcast, Louis Stowell. It's a brilliant pleasure to have you back in my virtual hall again.
I'm very excited to be there. I hope the feast is great.
Well, we haven't encountered Loki yet. I'm sure he's probably lurking in the background causing some mischief. Because, of course, that is the flavour of the month, I think, for you, definitely, with your writing. Although you have got many of the brilliant children's books out there. Because I know you've done one about a dragon in a library, I believe.
I've done some dragons. I've done some fairies, who, to be fair, is still on the kind of trickster theme. But the fairies are slightly more malicious than Loki because they steal babies.
Definitely. Then they're not the kind of like the flower fairy type image.
No, but I mean, those flower fairies are a Victorian lie, so you know, don't believe them. Don't mess with fairies.
So your kind of like journey and experience following the greatest trickster god of them all, I think definitely that has claimed that title in the 21st century, at least, Loki. Began Loki, A Bad God's Guide to Being Good, and to say out in a fancy new colourful edition with extra content and mischief involved, I believe.
They are, yes. Look at them in front of my face.
Don't worry, it will be popping up on screen.
It's just very fun drawing the whole new covers. There we go.
Oh, it's in lovely blue.
I've started, so I'll finish. So I'll have to see them all now. And two more. Sorry.
Okay.
And the last one, which is the first one. There we go. Yeah, so it's quite fun to redraw them because thinking about actually like trying to sum up a book, because the original ones were all just like random doodles, whereas I was trying to have, you know, a specific image that sums up the book. So that was fun to draw.
The cover of your books greatly inspired me when I was designing the thumbnail for your debut episode on our podcast this month. And of course, not many people may realise this, but you are the artist and illustrator of these wonderful books, as well as the writer for them.
Yes, indeed.
So I'm curious, have you always been writing first, or were you always drawing first, or was it always a bit of both?
Well, it depends how far back we go. If we go back to my childhood, then I was drawing first because, you know, you learn to draw before you can write. And I think, you know, sort of the natural child inclination is to draw and write at the same time once you can write. So I feel like kind of that is the natural human default, and just writing is something you're kind of, well, you get the pictures kind of beaten out of you, you know, metaphorically speaking. Though it was the 80s. And yeah, so I feel like, yes, so when I first came to writing novels, I did I did the text primarily, but I did design the characters alongside, even for books that I was never going to illustrate. And with Loki, again, I spent a lot of time doing character designs before I really got cracking. However, when I'm, you know, as a process, I write all the text first, and it's a pragmatic thing, really, because I do drastic edits on my text. So if I illustrated the text as I went along, there'd be so much wasted time, because I would be throwing those pictures in the bin. It will be a whole kind of plot line that goes, you know, I'll cut entire loops of plot. So it's text first, get that right-ish, and then the designer lays it out, leaving space for the drawings. Because when I write, I do write myself picture briefs, and I sometimes leave image briefs as well. So, for instance, I've just left myself a hideous piece of AI art in my document as a reference for something TBC. And often it's just a TV show I happen to be watching, and I'm like, I'm just going to draw those characters, because for background characters, I can't be bothered to think of that many faces, you know. So it's just like, you know, random third mother from the left at school happens to be one of the detectives from Deadlock, say, that I've just been watching. So that's the kind of process. And then with the illustration, then there's edits on illustrations as well as you have edits on text, you know, not as much, but partly because I sort of, my finished work isn't that different from my roughs, really. I quite a doodly style either way. So normally the changes are about realizing the joke isn't quite landing, or sometimes it's just an arm is at a really awkward angle or something, or just a kind of clarity issue. So, you know, the image isn't reading clearly enough.
That's really insightful, because they're kind of they do seem so natural, and as you just kind of like very doodle-esque. So it almost does, at least to us as readers, appear like you've just literally doodled them and then that's it. So I was always curious, especially with the design of Loki himself. Were there many versions of him before you settled on the one look?
Yeah, so I had,
like
you know, the original drawings were what I, you know, sent on submission to publishers. But once I'd got the deal with Walker, we kind of refined it, because I mean, I wasn't quite happy with it in various ways. Like, he had a very weak chin originally and it just didn't work. But my designer asked me, so originally he had a widow's peak, you know, when your hair goes down like that, a bit like Dracula. And the designer said it made him look too old. So I basically had to kind of make him a bit younger, because he looked a bit too, you know, like he's in his 20s or something, you know. And so little things like that. I think the t-shirt came right away. You always had that L for Loki, L for Liam, L for learner, because he's a learner at being good. So yeah, so there was quite a lot of development work there. I feel like the voice came very quickly. So he always sounded like that. And I had some back and forth with my editor about diction and exactly how formal his speech patterns should be. Because, as you know, he's thousands of years old. He's not necessarily going to kind of keep up with the contractions of language. But I feel like it's interesting, actually, because I mean, sometimes I really think into real detail. It's like, well, okay, so should he technically be speaking in Old Norse, but we hear him as English? And then I realized people don't care enough about that. So I'm just going to make him sound the way I think he should sound. Because I do an awful lot of world building in the background that I never put on the page, or rather I put on the page in the first draft. And then I realized the reader doesn't need to know that. You know, it's just something I needed to work out for myself. But yeah, so I feel like Loki did come fairly fully formed. And in terms of the look of the pages, that's very much what my notes looked like in meetings. That's what my university essays looked like. That's what my school book looked like. I always doodled on everything, and I always did it in a way that's very integrated with the text. And often when I was taking notes for, you know, like a university essay or something, I'd have a bit of a dialogue with myself with, you know, cartoon, like doodled characters that came out of nowhere asking questions. So I feel like I have actually been working on that design approach all my life without necessarily realizing that was something I was doing. And in my reading habits, I've always been very interested in how word and image are combined. So whether that's comics in the strict, you know, panels, sequential art kind, or graphic novels in the broader sense, or graphic fiction, or graphic even non-fiction. So something like William Blake, his Marriage of Heaven and Hell is, you could argue, a graphic novel. It's not sequential art in quite the strictest sense, not got panels, but it does tell a story using word and image in an inextricable way. You can't just take the text out and have no pictures and vice versa. People try, but I feel like you're missing something then. You're definitely changing it and you're almost translating it into something else.
That is really, really interesting to know, especially because I admire lots of children's authors, and equally I admire lots of children's illustrators, and I always kind of think those authors that also do the illustration, they must have a strong passion, if not a unique talent for it as well, because it's almost like double the workload to get the story right.
It's self-loathing in a way, because you are doubling your work. And also I tend to give myself these incredibly elaborate pictures to draw. So in book 1, there was a bit where when I was doing the image brief and my editor was reading it, I briefed myself that I was going to draw a monkey on a bicycle, because I was sort of having this idea of what's the hardest thing to draw, and I was like, a monkey on a bicycle. Though someone said a horse on a bicycle is actually harder, and I would agree. Anyway, monkey on a bicycle. But then I drew it, and the point of it was it's hard to draw, so if it wasn't perfect, it didn't really matter.
Mm. Well, I think the wonderful appeal that your wonderful, and I say wonderful many times because it is that wonderful, and the Loki books has, is that you've not completely done what some authors have, which is almost retell a lot of the more common, more popular known legends of Loki, so to speak,
Mm.
from Norse mythology. You've really kind of like brought him into the 21st century very, very, very physically, in that you've have Odin effectively banish him down to earth into the body of a teenage body to learn from his mistakes and correct his ways, which I absolutely think is a brilliant idea, because I don't think I've seen anyone else do it before in all
Mm.
the other kind of like more teenager to young adult Loki type fantasy books
Yeah.
I've read.
Well, I think people do tend to give him more angst than I have given him. That said, he's got buried angst, but he's not very good at acknowledging it. Yeah, so I'm always very interested in the intersection of the ancient and the modern in stories. So I'm much more interested in fantasy set in our world than I am in secondary world fantasy, as a rule. I mean, it's the exceptions. I love Tolkien, but I really like, for instance, Rivers of London, because you've got that very realistic London setting, but there's the hidden magic. But I also like the fish out of water narratives. So Loki is someone that doesn't belong here, and it's not just about him not fitting in, it's also about him reflecting ourselves back to us. So it takes an outsider to point out all the things that we do that are weird, and the way that humanity is weird. So I've given him this diary that it sort of has two functions. One is he's a liar, so you need the reader to be able to trust what's happening in the story to an extent. So the diary was originally, the reason I came up with it was because I needed a device to fact check Loki effectively, so that so you can actually get into the story, because otherwise you're in this kind of like completely unreliable narrator territory, which I think can work, but was not what I was going for. I just want slightly unreliable narrator, but you can kind of believe in the story. So there's the sort of the truth element of the diary, but also I wanted an opportunity to kind of have a commentary on our world without him necessarily having to go and learn everything for himself. So I've got a little device where Odin's written a book for him about a guide to the 21st century, and whenever he comes across something he's not familiar with, if he needs a definition, the book provides it. And that definition is filtered through Odin's point of view, because Odin wrote it. So they're not meant to be objective definitions, but they are, they sometimes reflect my views on things, but not 100%. So I'd say it's sort of like, I hope that children will understand that it's coming from a particular point of view. It's not, this is what the world is, but this is what Odin is telling Loki the world is. Because I think that kind of understanding of narrative perspective is something that children absolutely can grasp quite easily. But you obviously need to give them the opportunity to learn how that works. So there was a recent scandal in children's books discussing, well, basically a famous American author said that children's books are now too didactic, and caused a fuss. But I think for me, what's really interesting is what counts as didacticism. And I think mostly it's someone saying something I don't like, as in like it's heavy-handed if they're giving me a message I don't want. I mean, not always. Sometimes it is just heavy-handed. But I would say these books contain a lot of moral points of view, but not a single one. So there's not a kind of unified, I am saying this is what is right and wrong. It's an exploration of what right and wrong means from the point of view of a child, but also of an immortal god in the body of a child. So I'm sort of operating at how can children explore their own morality, but also how does that morality then work for someone who is not a child and is not even human? So it's, I don't know, I did philosophy A levels, so I spent a long time in my late adolescence learning to think about ethics from first principles. So I think Loki was my fictional attempt to do that, to have a bit of to ask the questions about what does it mean to be good, who gets to say what is good. Loki gets given a virtue score by the diary, and the diary is, you know, the consciousness of Odin as downloaded at a certain time, but with a purpose. So it's not full Odin. You know? It does develop its own personality after a while, through talking to Loki and basically being influenced by it. But its virtue score system is wildly unfair, I would say. It's not actually meant to be, this is what I think Loki deserves. It's Odin's particular whims in terms of what he's describing points to. And I do sometimes get kids saying it's not fair, and I was like, that's sort of the point, because there's not one person who gets to say this is right, this is wrong. It's something we come to collectively, you know, and something that can come out of discussion. So I would say, yeah, the Loki books are sort of a bit Jesuit in that way, perhaps.
Well, they're a wonderful vehicle and adventure of exploring all these different things, such as what it means to be good. Fairness, I know I've got a 5.5-year-old who's going on 15, and sometimes she uses that word simply because we've said no to her.
Yeah.
Like, it's not fair. And I'm like, I'm sorry, but whatever you said or done or want to do or haven't done, we're not supporting you on that kind of thing. And so she sometimes struggles to understand what it really means, and therefore how to really use it. As I kind of explained in the introduction, he is kind of like a god that has, but he's a figure that has a lot of appeal to all sorts of people from all sorts of backgrounds. And children, of course, can definitely relate on the mischief naughtiness level. But children, I found from reading children's books, and of course kind of like having one now myself, do tend to learn a lot from reading about other children more than reading about what good or bad adults are doing. So I think you do explore that really well by having Loki as a child, albeit not as a full corporeal child. He's just child in body but not in mind.
But he also is, because I think actually part of, I suppose, what I've realized is writing this is gods are children. They may have never been in a child form, but they never have to take responsibility for their actions. So they're a child in the sense of they haven't come into their sense of adult responsibility because they spend their lives doing what they want and using magic to solve their problems and just having fights. You know, no one tells the gods not to be violent. They just go and bash the giants. So it's sort of he's an immortal who kind of has always been a child. And yet he's never been a human child, so he's never had that experience of the kind of physical weakness or the vulnerability. So yeah, so if I'm kind of he's a mix of adult and child, but I do have real children in the book, in the persons of Valerie and Georgina, so his two best friends. So Valerie is incredibly serious and very kind of intellectually rigorous and logical in quite a sort of methodical way, whereas Georgina is much more of a wit, so she's much more kind of critical and much more kind of quick thinking, and both of them are in their different ways call Loki out on his nonsense. Georgina mostly by making fun of him, and Valerie by asking sort of serious moral questions. But also I suppose they show him what friendship means, you know, by their example, both their friendship with each other, but also how they treat him as a friend. And sometimes friendship is someone will hold you to account and not let you get away with things. And so, yeah, I feel like I've been trying to explore child friendships through the lens of someone who doesn't know how to have them. And I think that's something that a lot of children can relate to, because you know, it feels like everyone else knows how to do friendship better than you do, and they've got the rule book and you don't. And I mean, obviously it's not true for everyone, but I think a lot of children feel that sense that, like, it's not easy to make and keep friends. It's not easy to know what the right thing to do for your friends is, or how to not make them sad, or how to cheer them up. So I think there's, along with the exploration of what does it mean to be good, I'm also exploring what does it mean to be a friend. For an audience who are still navigating the not early stages of learning that, but you know, they're 10, so they've been in the friendship game for a while, but they've still got a lot of questions, and obviously are in a phase of life where things are rapidly changing, and you know, you're becoming more grown up, semi-adolescent, so things just keep getting more complicated. So hopefully Loki can offer a bit of a window into how you can navigate that from a position of not really knowing anything.
That is really interesting to learn, especially on the topic of friendship, because I know my own 5.5-year-old daughter, she's certainly in her approaching near the first end of her first year in reception, and she made quite a large group of girlfriends. She hasn't made many friends for boys, but quite often, now and again, she'll come home and she'll act a bit sad because a certain girl told her that, oh, I'm not going to be friends with you if you don't do this, or if you do that for me, then I'll still play with you, or they'll just not, or they've just completely said, no, I'm not going to play with you today. Yeah, and my daughter's like, why are they doing that? Why are they saying that? Kind of like, what have I done? And I'm like, they're still learning how to be friends, Naomi. As long as you play nice and civil and don't hurt their feelings, and as long as they're not hurting your feelings, just go and play with someone else. You have more than enough to go around. But it's a tricky thing to kind of like, because we obviously as adults understand that, okay, that's a bit cruel, a bit fickle, a bit kind of like not reliable, not even loyal, but then we're applying kind of like adult measurements.
I feel like you get a pass.
45-year-olds. So we just kind of teach it to tolerate and move on.
So I think I very much wanted to kind of, as you say, I didn't retell the myths, but what I wanted to have was the myths always hovering in the background. So there's that added layer of meaning for anyone that knows the myths well, and lots of little in-jokes for people that will get them. So Loki keeps telling fragments of Norse myths. So he'll refer to the time he was a horse, or the time he turned into a seal and fought Heimdall. And each time he'll say long story, with some hints at what the story about, tell you later, and then obviously never tells them. Except in these new editions where he's told some.
Wonderful. That is wonderful to hear. I was flicking through your Bell's Book Day book in 2024, and that actually has, I didn't realise, because I got it and then never actually read it. I apologise. I've kind of hoarded it on my daughter's behalf. Still, she's a bit old enough. But it has actually got my favourite myth of all, which, of course, is typically known as the Lay of Thrym, otherwise known as the incident where Thor gets into a wedding dress. And I love the illustration you've done for that wonderful thing. But I know when I read the Loki's A Bad God's Guide to Being Good first, couple of years ago, it had me laughing, and I'm an adult, so it had all the right notes on humor, and especially, of course, as you say, like kind of like those on the inside of Norse mythology who know and understand what's going on. And I think I'll always remember the bit, I think, where he had to draw a family tree for his class, and his teacher was criticizing him for having kind of like mentioning how he's got a son that's a snake. And I'm like, yeah, I know that, but the teacher doesn't. And it's that kind of that inside knowledge. I think kids really love to bounce off that kind of like, they know more than the characters do, if they're that kind of like clued up or read up on Norse mythology. Because there is so much out there for children on Norse mythology. I mean, I've got a little stash of books for my daughter, trying to slowly kind of like convert her to mummy's ways.
I mean, it's still obviously not as well known as Greek myths, and I think there's obviously a lot of cultural reasons for that, including the kind of classical education being the high status thing within kind of colonial Britain. And Norse myths sort of fell a bit by the wayside. They were never seen as quite as classy, and they aren't, because they're a lot more like silly, actually. Like Greek myths, horrible, very upsetting, but not very funny, Like there might be the odd funny one, but not many. Whereas Norse myths are very much on the like, and then he fell over, or and then he put on a girly frock, or and again, some of them are sad, but a lot of them are sad and silly at the same time. So yes, I would very much like for children to learn more Norse myths, because I think they are funny, and they are also, I think, if you're a British kid, they're very much part of our culture in ways that we don't necessarily know, whether that's place names, whether that's kind of, certain stories like Beowulf, which obviously is effectively a Norse story, and all the kind of the stories that then come after that. You've kind of got that sort of story DNA coming down from Scandinavia down through us. But generally, I just think they're great stories, and they're very much fun to play with, because you can just pick out silly details like my son's a giant snake, or that time I was a horse, and they're just funny in them. Even just those little snippets are quite funny. Also, I've got this sort of background of the power dynamics of all the gods when I'm establishing the family dynamics. So we've got Balder, who comes down to Earth to babysit, basically. So he's Odin's favorite son. He's perfect and handsome, and everything is, can do no wrong, almost invulnerable. And in my version of the story, is very close to Thor. And Loki's basically jealous, but also, I mean, Balder is kind of mean to him, like he's because he thinks he's not a good person, so playing with that sort of family dynamic, where also Thor feels insecure because Balder is Odin's favorite son. He's the legitimate son. I mean, we don't talk in those terms, but he's the the child of both Frigg and Odin, rather than extramarital business with Thor's mother. But I'm working on book 6 at the moment, and I do dig a bit more into all of that family background and those family trees, and how they impact on the characters emotionally, as well as what the myths actually say. So I tend to kind of, as a rule of thumb, I kind of set myself a limit to which text I was going to use as, for want of better word, the canon. So I sort of kept it pre-14th century. I was like, after that, it starts being folklore. That's its own thing. So the kind of, the peak Edda, the poetic Edda and prose Edda, with a few other little texts here, Saga of the Volsungs, that kind of thing. And I thought, I want everything that I'm portraying in terms of the mythology to have textual evidence within that scope of texts, unless I think of something funnier and I want to change it. So every now and then I will change something, not very often, but just that I'm giving myself that license, because the joy about mythology is there is no fixed source of it. It is it is potentially infinitely variable, and we don't even have the version written down from the era when the Vikings believed it. So all we've got is the Christian lens. So I feel like the Christian lens is something that I've had kind of in my mind. So the kind of the Snorri of it all, and the fact that Snorri is potentially an unreliable narrator as a result. Especially the bit where he says that basically Loki is Odysseus. But I mean, that could be true. Maybe Odysseus didn't exist, and Christopher Nolan's film is all about Loki. I would buy that. But yeah, so then with those kind of mythological roots in the true sense, kind of, I want them to have a certain authenticity. Then how I play with those within the story can be as playful as I like, because I feel like you do owe your readers a degree of accuracy is completely the wrong word, but yes, let's go with authenticity. I think if for the jokes to be funny, there needs to be something. They need to be referring to something, but one thing I haven't done in any way is I haven't tried to replicate Viking morality. So I haven't tried to say the gods have the same ethical framework as the Vikings, because I see the gods as very much their own family of weirdos. And some of the things that Vikings, thought were important, they think are important too, like fighting. But that's not because they're basically Vikings. It's because Vikings might have absorbed some of their rules, and also because a lot of people like fighting. So so for instance, when I was costuming the gods, I didn't want them to have Viking looking outfits. So I very much went with, so the gods have a slightly kind of 1970s glam rock vibe in their outfits, or occasionally Saturday Night Fever in Odin's case. And then the giants, the frost giants, the evil giants, have a more of a kind of like 80s hair metal look.
Okay.
And so I wanted them to have that sense of like they've got their own cultural specificity, but it doesn't map onto a specific Viking vibe. And then the elves are a lot more kind of overdressed in a slightly David Bowie from Labyrinth way, but also with kind of royalty elements, because they haven't got kings, they've just got lots of princes, because everyone's a bit up themselves in the elven realms. Well, that's so I go into this later, but there are 2 elven realms, because I was thinking about the different, the 9 realms and which ones count. And obviously there's the, I don't know how widely accepted it is, but most people seem to think that Svartalfheim is actually just another word for Nidavellir, rather than it being a separate elven realm. However, I have gone with it being a separate elven realm because I really like the idea of light elves and dark elves, and to interpret them as dark elves are elves who like forests and shade, and light elves are ones who like sunshine and beaches. And so, and the dark elves are nastier, but it's sort of a particular kind of like royalist, petty nastiness, and the sun elves are kind of slightly more communal living, basically, because in that kind of spirit of like, if you live in a nice place where everything's quite hospitable, then you don't need to fight as much, whereas if you live in a forest that might have some wild beasts, you're probably going to be a bit more dog eat dog about it all. So yes, in terms of my interpretations of the 9 realms, I was thinking about which ones I'm counting. I mean, also bearing in mind that there's a map at the front where Loki has not drawn it in a reliable way. He's written things like elves, more elves, fire, ice. So it's not that this map is anyway supposed to portray accuracy. No. And partly because I think it's funny that Loki doesn't care, but also that it sort of expresses what I think about mythology, which is any attempt to systematize it is missing the point. And actually stories have kind of more viability beyond something strict as a set of categories. So they kind of burst their banks a bit, stories. And so it's sort of, it's character, but it's also, I suppose, my notion of what story is and should be and can be.
That is really cool to learn, and I never actually thought about it, kind of like having light elves and dark elves, because of course from my many years ago excuse me, reading about Norse mythology, I just always came across dark elves meaning an alternative word for dwarves, effectively. Which is, I guess, the more fantasy canon type that's been set, that kind of like the opposite to elves or dwarves, basically.
Well, basically I also didn't want elves and dwarves to be in opposition in that way. Because I was like, other than Tolkien, what's the logic? Why should they be in opposition to each other? Except I love The Hobbit, and they fight in that. And I quite like the idea of them just being sort of like related but separate cultures. And it's actually sort of elves that have a bit more internal conflict, because they are quite inward looking. I mean, they're elves in the way I've portrayed them are both inward looking in their kind of infighting sense, but also they're very obsessed with humans. Because I see elves as mapping in that sense as mapping onto fairies, as in part of what they enjoy doing is messing with us. But in the sense of elves, I've said that they're quite likely to live amongst us, and all the most glamorous people in the world are potentially elves. So a lot of pop stars secretly elves, actors, all those kinds of professions hiding in plain sight. And it was very fun to play in the world of the elves, because in Norse mythology there just isn't very much about elves. There's quite a lot in more of up-to-date, more recent folklore in terms of the hidden folk in Iceland, but this is pre that. So there's, as far as I can find in that sort of era, I could only find the name of one elf who at least gets a story, and that's Volund. So he was sort of where I started with. And he is someone who has quite a hard life and doesn't react well to that hardship. So he's kidnapped and sort of tortured effectively. And he responds by killing the children of the person who captured him and turning their skulls into jewelry. So I feel like he's sort of, bad things were done to him, but also he's quite bad too. So I made my main elf character his son, who is brought in book 4 as Loki's enemy. So I should be able to stay a picture of him in here. So
yes. That's God's guide to making enemies, because that was actually going to bring me on to my next question.
There we go.
Because if Loki's, there it is, glorious.
So you can see he's got slightly kind of like royal ermine and little princey hat and everything. Princey hat, a crown.
Well, yes. I mean, I was going to ask as well, kind of like with Loki being the protagonist and effectively trying to not always be good, but kind of like learn about being good through some mischievous means.
Yeah.
Kind of like who, if he's not the typed bad guy in the book, who is? And of course, you've got more than one book going on, so he must come across different opponents, challenges, enemies.
Yeah. So partly he's his own enemy, and in book 3 that becomes quite. He becomes the bad guy in book 3 because he gets hold of Andvari's ring. So Andvari was a dwarf in the Volsung saga, in the saga of the ring, and he curses this ring because Loki steals it off him, and that leads to kind of a multi-generational curse with everyone dying and terrible things happening. So I've slightly tweaked the powers of the ring for story purposes. So what happened, the reason the curse works is it basically makes you hurt the people around you. And it's this one is probably my biggest nod to Tolkien, where the ring kind of talks to you and tells you to do bad things. And so Loki gets taken over by the power of the ring, and it sort of brings out all his worst impulses, and he nearly kills Thor as a result. But in most of the books, there is a villain. So in book 1, it's the frost giants who are trying to kidnap Thor and do various nefarious businesses. In book 2, there's an antagonist who's not, I would say, a villain, who I sort of don't want to say in case someone hasn't read book 2, because it's quite a big spoiler. But also giants. So the giants are kind of a consistent villain. They nip off in book 3. They actually go on holiday. And basically because Loki is his own villain there, so in a way they were a bit extra. So in book 4 we have Vanir the elf, who comes down to earth because Loki's insulted him, and he's coming to not declare war, but to challenge him to a duel. And elves are incredibly adept at wand magic, which is very loosely based on the magic that I do not know how to say, but it's something like Seiz.
Feeder or Sather.
Sather.
It's to do with it's the woman's magic of
Sather, yeah. So elves are great, and Loki is just learning. So he's his sort of mother on Earth is a giant, and giants are also very good at this magic. And his mother has given him a wand to learn, and he's trying to learn magic. He's not very good at it because you have to practice. But Vanir the elf, who turns up, challenges him to a duel. So kind of Loki spends a lot of that book thinking he's going to die, because he's going to face this elf. And the giants always pop up as well. They cause extra trouble. But then he has, I suppose, kind of antagonists that are more about things he's bad. Most of his antagonists are bad things he's done to other people that come back to haunt him. So he spends a lot of book 4 having ruined his friendship with Georgina, trying to repair that. As well as Vanir, the fact that he actually insulted Vanir, and that's why Vanir is here. And the villain in book 2 is also not villain. The antagonist in book 2 is also there because Loki messed with them. And then as we get into book 5, that's where I suppose we would start thinking about a bigger villain. And the stakes are kind of risen. So obviously, in book 4, Loki might die. That's bad. But in book 5, we have Freya, the goddess, coming to Earth, and she has power over love and war, and her magic becomes corrupted by insert mysterious villain. And this means that the characters start behaving very extremely and quite out of character, and you sort of realize that the people that normally are friends or beloved to each other are going to war, and the people who are normally enemies fall in love. So you have that kind of raising of the emotional stakes, but also this spell gets really out of hand, and it's sort of there's a battle at school and all these kind of big terrible things that aren't just easily solved. And like I said, I'm writing book 6 at the moment, so that's too much of a spoiler, I think, to say that Loki goes on a quest to find his children. His monstrous.
Speaking.
So Jormungand and Fenrir and Hel. I'm not counting Sleipnir among those because he's their mum, and that's slightly different. And also Sleipnir is very much in with the gods. Sleipnir is Odin's steed and accepted in that framework. Hel was exiled to Hell, and Jormungand to Midgard, and Fenrir bound. Obviously he escapes, spoiler. But so that's sort of, I think I've had the villainy has to get bigger as the series goes on. So the kind of end of the arc is at book 7, where we will get Ragnarok of a kind. And will we get Loki going home? That's what I would say.
Oh, well, it all sounds absolutely fascinating, and at some point I will continue the series because you've given me the itch now to read book 2 and see what else he gets up to. Because as you say, there are so many different antagonists and challenges and lessons, quite literally in various ways, that Loki has to learn about himself or about other people, or just about how to get along with the people. As you mentioned, kind of like friendships, there's relationships, kind of like siblings. Obviously kind of like trying not to always kill the first giant that you see, kind of thing. So as well as having all those antagonists and challenges come up, did you also have to think of that, okay, what's the kind of arc or theme that I want children, or even indeed Loki, to get out of this latest book?
So I think what children get out of it is their own business. So I've always thought, because I think as a writer, I have no control over what the reader responds. That's their prerogative. The reading is an act. It's a reader meets you in the middle or wherever they want to meet you, and they create their own meaning. So I think about it just in terms of, I suppose, what journey I want Loki to go on, and what I want him to learn and not learn. Because one of the things I realized, the reason book 3 came about, was if Loki got good too quickly, became good, then I'd not really have a story anymore. So I needed to kind of give him speed bumps and kind of up the ante of his moral challenges as well. So book 3 is a bit of a backslide, because he had actually learned some stuff in book 2, not loads, but some. So it's sort of a dance of he can't become too virtuous because then he won't be himself. And also the sort of story engine goes away. And I suppose it's never going to be about being good. It's going to be about being better. So, and I suppose authentic to himself and telling the truth to himself, because even though the diary fact checks the sort of objective truth of statements that Loki makes, it can't stop him from lying to himself. So if he fully believes something, the diary's a little bit iffy on whether that counts as a lie or not, and he's very sort of twisted in his own thinking. So I think at each book I tend to think of what is Loki going to get out of this? What's he going to learn? Where does he start? The kind of classic writer asking themselves questions of what does he want? What does he need? And I think about writing funny books as what does my character want, and what's the funniest way to stop them getting it? So at each stage, it's sort of how you frustrate your character. And when I go and give talks to kids about writing, I will basically sort of say that your duty as an author is to make your characters' lives a living hell. Because the more problems you have in a story, the more interesting the story. And obviously fallible characters are very appealing. So if your character tries to solve problems in a way that is absolutely wrong-headed, that's a lot more fun than if they make a very sensible set of choices. And I think, you know, this is true of Loki more than most. He is his own worst enemy. So he has external antagonists, but I think in the end, he's often fighting himself more than he's fighting them. And the kind of the giants, they're not that bright. They're not like very formidable villains in the end, because they can be beaten quite easily because they're not necessarily thinking things through. But it's often Loki's getting in his own way that stops him beating the giants or whatever's in case. Like, you know, with Veneer, he tends to make things worse before he makes them better. So yeah, there'll be a little kind of mini journey within each book, but then also his kind of macro journey, which I think is actually much less about being good and more about learning who he is and what he wants, where he belongs, what family means, what friendship means, and his place in the world. And you know, because obviously, like, his sort of goal is to get back to Asgard, but whether he'll actually want that by the end or not, you know, that's slightly up for grabs.
Yeah, and of course also up to Odin's approval to a great degree. I think that is probably, in a nutshell, the absolute appeal of Loki, in that it's certainly something I think I've connected to with a lot of the pantheon characters from the legends, is that I've often described them as human that just happen to have magical supernatural powers, toys, or life-plugging apples.
They're just guys. They're just a bunch of guys. I mean, like guys,
because they all make mistakes. Freya gets incredibly jealous. Loki, of course, always makes mistakes to get into or out of trouble. Thor just doesn't often seem to be too bright. I mean,
he's also very violent. Like, if you're a giant, he's
you know, he's very kind of like aggressive, combative. But of course, kind of like the way kind of like Odin never seems to get tarnished with being even labelled as a trickster, although I think in some ways he is an absolute trickster, because he deceives everyone about it.
But you know what? He's the boss, so he gets to say what goes. And that's the secret. I was saying to some group of children, they do blur after a while because I just talked to so many of them, but basically, like, what's the lesson you can learn from Loki? And it's like, be the boss and you can get away with whatever you want. And I'm not saying that's a good lesson, but it's a lesson one could learn.
And I think that links back to kind of like Loki kind of like always trying to not to get the upper hand, but certainly kind of like get into a position of maybe manipulation, persuasion, kind of like convincing, so kind of like people will then believe him more than hearing what other people are saying about him. Almost like coming to his point of view more than having him.
It's kind of a self-protection, isn't it? He sort of uses tricks as a form of safety, whether it's physical safety because he uses tricks to get out of trouble, or emotional safety. In a way, by having a reputation as the trickster, it's much easier to pretend that no one hurts your feelings, because it's like, oh, it's all a joke. I don't care. I'm just a merry japester, not someone who has really kind of like profound feelings of sadness or rejection. I suppose it's the sad clown thing. You know, he's not a sad person, but he does have a well of sadness sort of inside him, in a sense that he doesn't belong and he's an outsider and no one loves him, and therefore he does terrible things to stop people loving him, in a way, because it's in a way he's sort of saying, I'm choosing to stop people loving me. It's not that they don't, it's just that I'm doing these tricks and that's why they don't like me, rather than because of something fundamentally unlovable in me.
Yeah, that's a really nice way to encapsulate Loki's character. That's a really good insight. It certainly kind of like made me think to kind of slightly off topic, but I recently finished binging the latest Devil May Cry series on Netflix. And of course, the hero of that anime series called Dante, he is kind of like, he's got the Loki kind of like the wit, the sarcasm. He's always got kind of like epic one-liners that he drops when he's in combat with all these bad things. And yet kind of like in one kind of romantic / emotional scene where he's speaking with the female protagonist lady, he kind of says, kind of like, it's not that I don't care, it's not that I find everything funny, it's that if I show my pain, it's going to be too much. There's too much of it.
Yeah.
And that really kind of like made me think, when you were how you were describing Loki, back to how Dante basically summarized it up. And I thought that, I think that we see a lot in a lot of modern day heroes, kind of like, we want them to be witty and sarcastic and have kind of like these mic drop moments with the dialogue, but equally we like to see that they are like very much like us, they hurt for the same reasons that we would be upset, like if they got betrayed or if their mother or father died or that kind of thing. Lots of emotional baggage. And certainly in the fantasy fiction that I've read for young adults, Loki is very much, as you say, kind of like highlighting angst and emotional turmoil, and the whole point of view is spun on its heel, so we kind of see how he would feel being the way he is and being treated the way he is by the other Asgardians, and given that real outsider, kind of like someone who's made to do things that he doesn't always want to do, and it might not be more to him.
And
I
think
guess that relates.
When you're taking mythical characters, often in the way myths are recorded, you don't have a very fleshed out psychology for people's actions. It'll just be, this person did this. So in the story of at the start of the Volsung saga, where Loki and Thor and one other person, I can't actually remember who that is now. Anyway, someone else.
I'm sure it's Odin as well.
Odin, yeah. Anyway, they're just, they're having a laugh, and they come across a stream, and Loki just randomly kills an otter for no reason. And like, it's like, was it for food? Was it just because it was there? And I feel like that kind of unmotivated malice or unmotivated just actions in general, like, there's no context for these things. It's often like they go off on a journey. Why? Don't know. They just do. So when you're writing the interiority of those characters, you have to come up with reasons for why they do the things that they do. And a lot of children ask me, why is Loki bad? And so I can't necessarily go into the adult idea of trauma, but I think I slightly hedge my bets, and I'll say a little bit like, sometimes, to an extent, it's his nature because he is a trickster god, but it's also a reaction to how he's treated by others and his way of coping with the fact that he doesn't quite fit in. So describing it as a bit like, sometimes when people at your school are being naughty, it's because they're having a bad time at home or something. So try to describe it as, it's partly because he's got a personality where he's a bit of a trying to think of a non-swear word, so and so. But also there is a reason he's doing it in reaction to something, whether that is someone, how he's being treated, or just his own emotional makeup. So yeah, I think sometimes, so when I do the retellings of stories, I often realize, wow, that just makes no sense in the myth at all. Why would someone do that? So I have to come up with a reason why they do it, or kind of skip over the reason by making a joke, because I'm in the story of Thor's fishing trip that I have in the extended edition of book 1. I sort of have the running joke that Thor's terrible at telling stories. So he keeps not giving reasons for anything, and then Loki has to kind of wheedle the reasons out of him and help him tell the story. Not help by So Thor's writing the story in the diary, and Loki keeps snatching the book back and adding doodles, and sort of eventually we get the whole story out of it. But it's I think that was partly my way of exploring the fact that myths don't make sense, or they don't have narrative coherence necessarily. Especially when you have different versions that pull in opposite directions, or if not opposite, but like slightly competing directions. But I do love the kind of weirdness of the specificity of myths. So like Loki in bird form turning someone into a nut to carry them. So I did actually just take that wholesale and put it in book 1. So he turns Valerie into a nut to carry her. No explanation why, just he does. And it sort of makes an intuitive sense of it is like about the an eagle's claw or whatever kind of bird it was. That could fit a nut in. But yeah, kind of So no, it's an interesting line to walk between the absurdity of the myth and then taking the story seriously, you know.
Yeah, I mean, that it makes so much sense when you, excuse me, kind of like how almost simple on the nose and if not direct a lot of the Norse myths are, at least the recorded versions of them that we have. So as you said earlier on, kind of like we don't know how they were told at the time the Vikings were around. We don't know who told them. We don't even know half the time who even wrote them down to begin with. A lot of these kind of like scribes are all anonymous. So it's always going to be open for interpretation, but I think that's the magic ingredient behind these myths, and that they are so open to interpretation that we can, that your stories, amongst with many others that I've read, kind of like Joanne Harris with her Gospel of Loki and Runemark series, and other authors, are just so able to bring them forward into today's world to make them relatable and connectable for modern readers, both children and young adults and adults alike. But I guess the most important question I should ask you, Louis, is kind of like, what brought you into Norse mythology to begin with? What captured your imagination?
Okay, well, I think we need to rewind to the early 80s. Imagine me age 3, something like that. I'm watching TV and I'm absolutely transfixed by what is on the screen. And it's giants. There's these giants walking around on a stage. And it was a production of Wagner that happened to be on TV that my parents turned on, and I just kept watching it. I was obsessed. I liked the music because I was quite a nerdy child, obviously, but well, you know, it's loud, rah. And so, but it was most of the giants that I was captivated by, because it was, I think the giants were either people on stilts or people on each other's shoulders. I'm not sure. It was, I will look up the production because it was quite a specific one that was very much a kind of like industrial Soviet landscape.
Okay.
And so I got really into that. And then later I took up the trumpet. And so that got me further into Wagner and sort of learning the stories. Because as a trumpeter in an orchestra, I played jazz as well, but in a youth orchestra, Wagner has great trumpet parts. You know, it's all I mean, most of the Wagner tunes that you might sing, it's the trumpet part you're singing, you know, the Ride of the Valkyries and things. And so that kind of got me further into the stories from that way, but I was coming at it from different angles. So I also got quite into sort of Viking legends in general, and sagas. So I had a Terry Jones book called Eric the Viking, which was the kind of saga Eric the, which Eric was it? I actually don't remember now. It was either Blood
it is saga of Eric the Viking, but yes, it's
anyway.
I did an episode on that a couple of months ago, and you know, I think you're the only second person I've come across that actually has heard of it or read the book.
Yeah, so I actually met Terry Jones when I was a kid. That was my first book signing. I think was Terry Jones, and he was very kind, and he talked to me for quite a long time. You know, I was probably about 6 at this point, and we were talking about the fact that I was named after my great auntie Louisa, but everyone called her Louis, so I was called Louis. And he was talking about the fact that he had a great auntie Louisa. And until about 20 years later, possibly longer than that, I thought we were related because I thought it was the same great auntie Louisa. And I later realized, no, he just had an auntie called Louisa and he was humoring a 6-year-old. But yeah, so there's that strand as well. And then there's Beowulf, which I loved. I had the Dragon Slayer version, which was the Rosemary Sutcliffe version without all the boring bits. So it's just the fights. So it's Grendel's mum, the dragon, Bosch.
Yeah.
And when I came to read Beowulf in full at university, I was a little bit disappointed with all the bits that are like lists of names and things, you know. But yeah, so Beowulf, loved that. And then Tolkien. So obviously Tolkien is sort of, a lot of it comes from Norse mythology, whether it's, you know, elves or trolls or languages, and the Ring.
Even Gandalf, his name is from the list of dwarf names.
Yeah, which is hilarious, from a list of dwarves, random. But it means wand elf. And yes, all the list of dwarves. When I you know, so I'll come on to reading the Edda later, but yeah, in the list of dwarves, it's like, wow, that's Fili, Kili, whatever, like all these guys, they're in the Norse myths. so had it through Tolkien, had it through like the Usborne Book of Norse Myths, like I imagine a lot of people do, which had very heavy metal illustrations. And later I went on to work at Usborne, so I was tasked with writing a book of Norse myths retellings. So this was probably like 2010 or something, like, God, over 15 years ago. And in doing the research for that, I went and read the Prose Edda, the Poetic Edda, the Volsung Saga, various other sagas before realizing they didn't have any myths in them. And so that was my first experience of the Norse texts, the Icelandic, writing down of those myths. And that's where I was really made the connection with Tolkien, the kind of, because Tolkien had given me the kind of innate love of it, but I didn't realize I was loving Norse mythology at that time, So I feel like, and again, I didn't realize the stories in Wagner were the same stories, up to a point, because the sort of the Germanic version, and
oh yes,
I mean, I suppose the Germanic version's in theory older, but not Wagner's version, but and I don't know that much about the Great Migration period, but definitely that Germanic tribes came into Scandinavia. So but I had the kind of, I suppose, an over-determination of a love of Norse mythology from lots of different angles. But it was the kind of, I suppose, the slightly more scholarly approach I took in researching this book of Norse myths retellings. And I was working on it with another colleague, and basically we sort of divvied it up. I was more interested in Loki and was more interested in Thor, so he focused on the Thor stories, the Loki ones, and the ones that are both we just kind of muddled through. And I like the end of the world, so I did Ragnarok. Anyway, and so kind of going back to those texts, and I sort of got very into the character of Loki as a result, because so much of what he does is like, wow, you're such a dick. So reading Lokasenna, so his insult battle, fascinating. But it wasn't until later that I read that there's the insult battle between Thor and Odin. And it's
Odin's
really
in disguise.
mean.
He doesn't even declare himself. He just does it all behind
Odin
disguise.
is so, like, that is like an act of child, not neglect, but like cruelty,
abuse.
It's horrible. So it's interesting. I feel like Lokasenna gets all the attention for how mean Loki is, but it's like, Odin always getting away with things. He's up to something. But I loved reading Lokasenna, and it's like, wow, those insults are pretty harsh and definitely quite scurrilous. One of the things I found quite strange was in terms of people's sort of academic discussion of Lokasenna. So many of them seem to just believe Loki's telling the truth. I mean, like, as in that's how it's treated. And it's like, doesn't necessarily, like, he's probably making stuff up, right? He is a liar. But I suppose it's the ones where they don't deny it. That's the ones where you think, okay, that probably is true. But and you get beautiful little fragments of myths that you don't get elsewhere in Lokasenna.
Yes, you do. There's you mentioned so many names, or people mention names in kind of like rebuttal of his offence. Because so many people, he kind of like picks them one by one, and they all kind of like step up, and it kind of like goes a paper chain of exchange of insults. So I remember speaking to an American artist called Sam Flegel, who's done a beautiful kind of like ink blob and line illustration, his interpretation of the Lokasenna, and I would have loved to have done it back on Kickstarter, but he can't afford shipping costs to the UK, so I've never had a copy. And it's like a physical print edition, but it was really interesting talking to him, because of course he studied each verse and then kind of like meditated on it and then brought it into our work. And so many names kind of like related to so and so's brother, or so and so's kind of like servant or thrall, or kind of like how many times he mentions that Freya has basically slept with everyone. And like Frigg and Sif step up and say,
I think he's projecting,
them.
But so Lokasenna was one of the stories that is genuinely too rude for me to retell for children. However, I did a version of it. So in did an activity book that had some short stories and things for Loki. and I basically, instead of it being set in the future before Ragnarok, Lokasenna is in the past, and it's just before he gets kicked out. It's actually the night before he gets kicked out of Asgard, and it's the night that he cuts off Sif's hair. Now, this is not the first time he's done it.
Yes.
So in the mythological past, he already cut her hair off and got the gold wig and everything. That's the past. So this is the second offense. So the same night that he does that, he also insults Vanir the elf, who then comes back and gets him in book 4. So I had quite a lot of fun with that story. So it's basically, he does sort of go around insulting people, but I just made the insults a bit less sexual, basically. And, you know, in keeping with his child-friendly persona.
I must admit, now that kind of like when you mentioned about how direct the myths are, kind of like it's stated so simply that kind of like Sif wakes up to find no hair, and Thor immediately accuses Loki, and Loki eventually admits it under some brutal beatings.
But obviously it's Loki, you know. But then when it's, you know, there's sometimes when he didn't do things and he gets accused of them, you know. So that's kind of what book 2 is about, is him being accused of something that for once he didn't actually do. Sometimes it was a giant or something, you know, like there are other villains out there. It's not every, you know, it's not everything is Loki.
Oh, well, I for one cannot wait to read book 2, 3, 4, 5, and of course eventually 6 when it comes out later. And I guess kind of like I'll close up by asking kind of like, do you know how many more books there might be of Loki's life story on Earth?
So my arc is 7 books. So that takes us to Ragnarok. So 2 more. But I do have an idea for how you'd open that story arc out again and broaden out the world. Whether I will ever get to do that, I don't know, because I've got other books I want to write. But the story is there and has been from the start. So I've always had the complete arc and then the next arc in my mind. And I think because for me, the Norse myths are cyclical. They do begin again. So you've got the Michael Finnegan of, you know, Balder being kind of part of the new regime of gods, and the golden chess pieces left behind, and the idea of like, I suppose again with the Tolkien thing of like the 4th age, the age of, you know, the age after the gods, even though there are still gods. So that's sort of, I do want to reflect that mythological shape to an extent, even if it's just that at the end of book 7 you get a sense that things could continue. Yeah, but it's been really fun doing the expanded editions, because it's that chance to go deeper into the world. So in one of them I've got an interview with Caroline Larrington, that's done with Loki interviewing her.
Oh, wonderful.
Really narked that she's more interested in Odin than Loki in her academic work. So yeah, so he's pretty he's pretty petty about that. But it was great to get her kind of point of view on things, and, you know, asking things like what got her into Norse myths, and it involved a holiday in Iceland for part of it, and meeting some, no, it was a holiday in Iceland, but it was meeting some Icelandic people on holiday and hearing their stories. So yes, it's nice to delve into that. And then I've got more kind of context about what life in Asgard is like, and how that contrasts with life on Earth. And then some more kind of playful things, like there's an insult generator and a prophecy generator. So, you know, you pick like the first letter of your name, the day you were born, your favorite color, and then that gives you your prophecy or your insult.
Very good. Very good. Oh, well, that just makes them even more appealing and attractive and fun for any child lucky enough to get them given birthdays, presents, Christmas presents, or just generally being a good bookworm and just encouraging reading, because I know you're a big ambassador for reading of all things.
Yeah, so with that in mind, actually, I should say I'm an ambassador for reading in many ways. So whether you read with your eyes or with your ears. So I would highly recommend the Loki audiobooks, actually. So they're read by Ben Wilbond, who he plays the captain in Ghosts, and he was in Horrible Histories, and he does such a good job. He's incredibly, he plays Loki as this slightly kind of pompous public school boy, but also with a sadness in him, and he does an incredible Heimdall voice as well, which I'm not sure, I can't do justice to, but Heimdall's job in Asgard is to guard the Rainbow Bridge, and his job on Earth, when he's pretending to be human, to be Loki's father, is as a bouncer and as a security guard. So Ben's version of him is very much like, well, a bit like a bouncer, you know. So he's got that kind of like gruffness.
Oh, that's wonderful to hear, because I know my daughter's got the Box Block audiobook player, which I actually discovered simply because I remember you reposting it and how it had the Loki audiobook player. I thought, oh, that looks perfect for Naomi, because
I would like my commission from Box Block then.
But yes, but I'm just waiting for it to get that little bit bigger, and then I will definitely be introduced to these books.
How old is she now? 5?
5.5.
I think probably like you could probably do the audiobooks at 6.5, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends on the time. Obviously everyone's different. My nephew's 5 and he just likes looking at pictures with the bums in the book, so you know.
Oh, well, kind of like she has got a slight interest in Vikings. I did get this wonderful big it's called Hide and Seek History, and it's like a big flap book, but kind of like flaps for like toddlers, but this one's like for big kids, and there's often like flaps within flaps within flaps, like sometimes 3 layers to it. And there's a nice page about mythology, and I kind of like mentioned how she knows about Thor, and I said, oh well, there's also Loki, and there's Odin, and of course they've got brothers and sisters and mums, and she goes, oh, tell me about Thor's mum and dad. And I'm like, okay, one night we'll have a Norse bedtime story. But I think she'd love and find this funny, because she's got a very good sense of humour. It's just a case of working out how much her own understanding of how the world is, and of course that's beautifully explored through Loki, without getting her upset of this, that and the other, because she has got a sensitive soul, bless her. But I do absolutely applaud anyone with kids aged 6 and upwards to get these books, whether it's an audio or the World Book Day book or the activity pack. They're all absolutely brilliant. They're all entertaining for us adults to read, as well as read with the children, because that's also a great aspect of reading. And I will continue to follow you and your Loki adventures, and of course your wonderful work for reading in all forms, shapes and sizes, for many years yet to come, I think.
Thank you. It's been a joy to talk to you.
Yes, thank you for joining me in Valhalla.
Excellent.